Well, a very warm welcome to you, ladies and gentlemen, to the third in this semester's series of motivational sessions on repertoire and interpretation, which in the first instance I started to hold last semester during lockdown for the Charles University Orchestra and Chorus members and the members of the Prague University of Economics, which this semester I decided we should extend to other friends from sister orchestras and choirs and friends thereof, indeed members of the philosophical faculty of Charles University, members of various musical groups with particular repertoire interests, and in fact anyone who loves orchestral and choral music. The first two sessions were on Mahler's 10th symphonies and Bach's Mass in B minor, respectively. But today we're going to talk about a piece that is not only very close to me, but also very close to the Charles University Orchestra, who have performed it with me in its entirety no fewer than 8 times, I think, as well as having performed various bits and pieces on a number of occasions in the past, including our most recent concert just before lockdown in mid-September, even before the university semester started. And that piece is the Komitas Sahakiants Liturgy for strings. It is a work for string orchestra, a beautiful piece. It's a concert piece that draws on and has adapted various movements from Archimandrite Komitas's arrangement of melodies of the Armenian Divine Liturgy, which is very traditional music that has reached us largely by word of mouth, although at different stages, various musical notational systems have also helped in the transmission of those melodies. And the fact that such an ancient tradition has survived and reached us and been beautifully arranged to form a very, very effective and moving concert suite is in itself remarkable. And it is a great pleasure to present it to you. I realize that many of you have heard it many times because you come to my concerts in Prague and elsewhere, and yet others, many of you are here now, have actually played it under my direction and done it with great sensitivity and passion, for which I'm extremely grateful. So as an introduction, I shall play you an excerpt, which is a version of the Lord's Prayer, but in the original choral version, from a service in which I served in Prague's Church of St. Giles, Svatý, a few years ago. Those of you who have played the suite will immediately recognize it. But this is not the first movement of the suite. The suite, in fact, starts with the only part of the work that was actually composed by Komitas, as opposed to being transcribed and or arranged by him. And that is the patriarchal prayer. And I should like now first to play you the choral version, which Komitas wrote. He had actually set that piece to set the words that were composed by his classmate, Haig Utidjian, initially in 1891, when he was a very young student at the seminary in Haig Utidjian, but then he composed the melody that we now know in 1895. And the version I will play you was broadcast by Czech television with an awful single microphone placed in front of the mouths of one or two of our choral members when we were invited to perform to Pope Benedict XVI in 2009. And then I shall play you the arrangement for strings in the European premiere that the Charles University Orchestra and I gave at the Czech Museum of Music in 2014. So I shall try to find the appropriate bit in this video. I need 3 minutes and 35 seconds. Let's see if I can aim properly. Yes. I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that the actual sound in Prague Castle's Vladislavsky Saal was much more magnificent. The sound that we're hearing now was picked up by a single microphone. Unfortunately, the live broadcast was covered by the news services of Czech television, not the cultural services. Now, compare that to the version with which Sahakiants chose to start his suite. Right. Let's hope YouTube behaves by not starting other things that I did intended to start. Ladies and gentlemen, the most interesting thing is that, in fact, for this opening, which serves as a prelude to his concert suite, Sahakiants didn't change anything compared to the choral version. But later on, we shall see that he has made adaptations in a very, very skillful way and displaying a very light touch, because the Komitas version of the liturgy can be considered to be a masterpiece of the first rank, and one doesn't change anything lightly. But what he has changed and altered and done a little bit of transposition here and there, cutting and pasting here and there, modulating even in one or two cases, adding an extra voice to the counterpoint here and there, has been in order to make it work effectively as a concert piece. Before we proceed to the next movement of the suite, let us consider who exactly Komitas was. He was a monk. He was an orphan. He was born in a place called Haig Utidjian, now in Turkey, very famous for their porcelain and tile production. He lived in poverty, but then he was very lucky. Out of 20 orphans, he was chosen by lots to be taken to the seminary in Etchmiadzin, where he could get an education. But when he arrived, he was almost expelled because it was found that he could actually not speak any Armenian at all, only Turkish. But he had the opportunity of singing the ancient Christian hymn, Luis Zavart in Armenian, Phos Hilaron in Greek, Hail, O Gladsome Light, in one of the well-known Anglican translations. And he sang it so beautifully and with such musicality, apparently, that the head of the church, no less, the patriarch, decided that he ought to be admitted. Now, he did have problems as a young novice and as a young monk there, because he engaged in practices that were frowned upon by the monastic community. Far from staying confined to the cloisters of the monastery, he actually went to visit various villages, asking the villagers to sing to him, and he would note down their melodies. Whether it was a man working in the field, cultivating the fields, singing to his oxen, or whether it was a group of village girls that were singing and dancing, he would go with his notepad and note down those melodies, many of which have been preserved thanks to his own transcriptions. And this activity of his is very reminiscent of similar things that were being done by Bela Bartok and Leos Janacek and others. And it is said that Komitas once even started notating the braying of a donkey, but apparently the donkey finished in a different key than that at which he started. So Komitas got rather annoyed and reprimanded the donkey for singing out of tune. Then, due to the help of a benefactor, he was able to go to Berlin, where he studied for 3 years, and that was a very important period in his life. He didn't have enough money, and often he would not eat. But in terms of musical and intellectual stimulation, it was a marvelous experience. He even heard some of Wagner's operas and gained a lot of contacts. He learned harmony and counterpoint, the piano. He made his first mature compositional attempts. And shortly thereafter, he returned to the Mother See as a monk, but he also lectured and organized choirs and conducted in various European cities, also Tiflis, Tbilisi in present-day Georgia, in Alexandria in Egypt, where, as it happens, he stayed in my paternal grandmother's house as their guest, and my grandmother, who was a little girl then, did have some memories of Komitas, always full of energy, always apparently feeling rather nervous and agitated, with his head full of his plans and things that he wanted to do. In Paris, he earned the admiration of Debussy and various others. He lectured and performed there, And in 1912, he made a number of 78 RPM recordings, which have been preserved, where he's accompanying an opera singer called Armenat Shahmuradian, who was a soloist at the Opéra Comique and La Scala, as well as singing himself. His own musical activities were not really tolerated by the Mother See of Haig Utidjian, which was a very conservative and relatively backward place at the time. So he hired a room in Constantinople, and that's where his base was for the rest of his active creative life. And that's where he made arrangements of the various songs that he had collected, beautifully sensitive piano accompaniments, harmonized versions, and he organized more choirs, gave concerts, and again, he incurred the displeasure of church dignitaries by even going so far as to perform his choral versions of liturgical items on the concert stage, something that had not been done until then and was looked down upon. There are various historical photographs of the various choirs that he organized, but this is one of them, taken, I think, at around 1910. And this is a Constantinopolitan Greek musical magazine, kindly drawn to my attention by Professor Alexander Lingas of Oxford University, where the editor and himself a musicologist and composer of distinction, Georgios Pachtikos, who had attended one of Komitas's concerts in Constantinople in 1912, wrote a very detailed review of it. In a different issue of the same magazine, he even conducted an interview with Komitas. And this Greek musician was greatly impressed, both by the work of Komitas as a phenomenon, and by the quality of his harmonizations and arrangements. And in fact, there's a lot of interesting information we can glean from his writing indirectly. So I've transcribed and translated it and published it in a couple of places, including the Clavibus Unitis Philological Musicological Czech journal. So this is a specimen of the way in which Komitas's musical activities were received at the time. He made his arrangement. He embarked on several different arrangements for various forces at different times, but the arrangement of the Divine Liturgy, on which Sahakiants based his suite for string orchestra, was made virtually on the eve of the Armenian genocide and Komitas's deportation on the 24th of April 1915. Sadly, the experience traumatized him, and he lost his mental balance and spent the last decades of his life in a mental asylum in Paris and was not able to continue his creative work. My own late teacher, Vahan Bedelian, as a student, sought to have a meeting with Archimandrite Komitas and visited the mental hospital where he was staying in 1927. And he wrote this heartfelt letter that you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. Very respectful, very sincere, asking if Komitas would allow a short meeting, that he, Vahan Bedelian, was going to embark on a musical career and a teaching career, and he would like to be inspired by Komitas and to learn his art and spread it further. But apparently Komitas was really not able to realize what was going on by the sound of it, because he apparently crumpled the letter in a state of fury, in a paroxysm of fury, and he threw away that crumpled piece of paper of this letter that you see now onto the floor. And subsequently, at the request of Vahan Bedelian, the nurse who was looking after Komitas at the asylum picked up that crumpled piece of paper and gave it to Mr. Bedelian, who managed to iron it and framed it. And in his music room, where he would teach his pupils, he had it on the wall, and he would show us all, his pupils, about his encounter or near encounter with Komitas, a very moving personal flavor, as it were. And Komitas passed away in 1935, and eventually he was interred, he was buried in Armenia after much diplomatic effort, because of course the Soviet authorities were very, very uncertain whether it would be okay to allow a funeral and the burial to happen or not, but it did eventually happen. And then he was treated from then on as a sort of national icon and a hero. So this was in Paris in 1936, a few months after he passed away. Now, let us turn to the suite now, having said something about Komitas' arrangement of the Divine Liturgy, although we shall return to the melodies themselves as well in a moment. On the left-hand side, upper corner, is a photograph of Zareh Sahakiants. He was a very gifted Soviet-era Armenian violinist, chamber music professor, a first-class string quartet player. There are little snippets, recordings of his playing Haydn and Shostakovich quartets with fellow members of his quartet. And he decided to make an arrangement of the Divine Liturgy and other hymns and sacred chants that Komitas had harmonized at different times. And I think that it was a stroke of genius, the decision to make such arrangements and create a coherent concert suite out of it. The fact that he did it and the way in which he did it, I think, are both remarkable. And interestingly enough, as a kind of counterpart, you can say there's an odd sort of anti-symmetry. Whereas in Komitas' lifetime, he was very much criticized for taking liturgical chants onto the concert stage, and in doing that he angered a lot of church authorities. At Sahakiants' time, there was the opposite problem, in that it was not encouraged to perform church music or to record church music, but he realized that if he made an arrangement for orchestra, then it becomes a concert piece, and the communist authorities will allow him to perform it and record it. And he did record it for Melodia, I think in 1975, although the LP that I have, it's a mono recording, dates from it was issued in 1979, and it's beautifully played. And from what I heard from people who were involved or knew people who were involved, these were very fine chamber music players who were involved, from what I gather, either they were not paid, they did it out of the goodness of their hearts and out of their passion for the music, or they did the work in very poor conditions. But it's very beautifully played. It seems that Sahakiants was leading the group by playing the violin himself, and the solos he played himself. And you get the feeling that all the musicians are absolutely listening to each other, and they all are in sympathy with the music and understand the idiom, and they are playing as if they were one person. I became acquainted to this music from radio broadcasts during my childhood in Cyprus, and I was determined to find the score, and I couldn't. And people said, well, you can make your own arrangement. You have the score of the choral Divine Liturgy. But of course, Sahakiants had done what he had done so very skillfully that I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. And I was extremely lucky in that when I was invited to conduct the Armenian Philharmonic Orchestra in, I think, 2003, I made a point of visiting the principal conductor of the Armenian Chamber Orchestra, which Sahakiants himself had founded. A very nice gentleman called Aram Garapegyan, and a very fine conductor as well. Unfortunately, he died at a young age. And I'm so grateful for the generosity of Maestro Garapegyan, because when I visited his office, I introduced myself to him. I can't even remember if he came to my concert or not. And I said, do you happen to have a score of the arrangement of the liturgy by Sahakiants for string orchestra? And he said, yes, I have it, here it is. And he turned back behind his desk, there was a bookcase, he opened it and said, there you are, here it is. If you run to the other side of the street, there's a photocopier's shop and you can Xerox it and return it to me. And that's exactly what I did. And to this day, I'm so grateful to Haig for his generosity. In time, with the help of Dr. Vladimir Faltus, we produced individual sets of parts. I had to edit the music. There were a lot of errors in the published score, and these I had to correct. And also, I took account of certain things that Sahakiants himself had done in his own recording. And I'm hoping that this new performing version will be published before too long, together with a monograph about the circumstances behind the creation of this very fine arrangement. But now I propose that we go back to the very beginning, or if not the very beginning, let's go back to, as far as we can, to the earliest ancient codices and manuscripts, which give us the first indications of this music. The second movement of the suite is the hymn that is sung at the beginning of every single divine liturgy, O mystery deep, horut horin. And historical sources attribute this hymn to the abbot of the monastery that you see in this picture in a place called Haig. Apparently, sometime around 1204, the various primates of the Armenian Church had a council, and they decided that they would have a mass held, a liturgy, the divine liturgy, celebrated in the open air. So it was a field mass in Lori, in the north of present-day Armenia. And this monk, known as Khachadur of Daron, he lived at the end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th, just stood up and he sang this for the first ever time. He sang it himself. And everyone was so impressed that this hymn made its way into the Armenian Divine Liturgy. Now I shall do something very interesting, or I hope you will find it interesting. The melody that is usually sung these days, I should like to play it in a recording made by another teacher of mine, the late Archbishop Zareha Zaborian of blessed memory, who, when I was a child, he sang this and other things on some cassette tapes so that his pupils, such as myself, would gradually learn those melodies by playing the cassette tapes. And I shall play you first his own singing of it. It's not meant to be a professional recording, he just sang it for teaching purposes, but I should like you to hear it. And then I shall go ahead and play you the version in the suite. the first part sung by my late teacher, Archbishop Zareh. And now you can hear the version with a solo violin and the strings, with the pedal held by strings playing reiterated notes. Strictly speaking, it's not a tremolo, it's reiterated notes, reiterated as fast as possible, senza misura. And you will see that Sahakiants has really done it justice. And the solo violin is Lydia Penchev. Yeah. Now, I would like us to see if we can push things a little further still into the past. Can we go further back than the 13th century? Well, the answer is we can, slightly, in that we have accounts, historical accounts, and also the attestation found in various medieval manuscripts to the effect that Saint Narcisse the Gracious, who was the head of the Armenian Church during the third quarter of the 12th century, he composed a lot of the hymns of the Divine Liturgy, words as well as music. And apparently he endowed the liturgy with sweet melodies in a mystical manner. And an account says he would enrich the mystical songs with spiritual songs and sweetly musical melodies, so that the thickest minds of those beholding the Holy Sacrament be mellowed by the contemplation of what they can sense, and benefit in attaining the vision of that which cannot be sensed, but which is intelligible. So the music and the beautiful experience of the senses would be a sort of gateway to allow the listeners to engage in the contemplation of that which the senses cannot detect, but which perhaps the intellect, the eye of the mind may be able to behold. So this is an image from a breviary manuscript that is kept in Vienna at the monastery, where, as it happens, the Charles University Orchestra and I performed this suite. So this manuscript is kept there. On the other side is a famous prayer composed by the saint as well. And as I said, we can find sources. This is one of the earliest ones I know. It's kept in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and it has those very chants. But we can't read the music. These musical signs, these neumes, have not been deciphered, unfortunately. So we don't know what the music is. But I should be honest enough to tell you that it is very, very unlikely that these melodies are the same ones that we play in the Sahakiants suite. We're talking about, 700, 800 years, and the melodies did evolve and different variants were produced. But it is a very special experience to look at these manuscripts, because in fact, they are the same chants. They have the same words as are sung these days. And the melodies that Komitas transcribed or harmonized, and which then Sahakiants adopted, belong to the same organic tradition of which these manuscripts are the earliest witnesses. And in fact, on the right-hand side folio, there is a note that says that this was sung by Saint Nerses, Lord Nerses, the Catholicos of the Armenians. That's the title of the Armenian Supreme Patriarch, the head of the church. And this thing we also play in the suite, as we shall see later. And there are other manuscripts also. This is slightly later. On the left-hand side bottom, you hear the Sanctus, which also we play as the last movement of the Sahakiants suite. And this is yet another manuscript, slightly later. And it's interesting because most of the neumes, the musical signs, are in red in this manuscript. So you can readily tell what is a letter that belongs to the verbal text and what is a musical sign. Well, we can't understand those neumes, but there is quite a lot we can do with them. For example, we can compare how the melody may have evolved by looking at earlier manuscripts and later ones. So here I compared the neumes that are found on the first word of the Sanctus, which is surp in Armenian, a chain of neumes for the first two manuscripts and a single neume on the third one. This doesn't cover a very large span of time. You know, it's from 1241 to 1313, going on to 1377. But the interesting thing is that whereas for the Lord's Prayer, which you can see on the top half of the second page, and for the first word of the Sanctus here on the left-hand side, top half, the neumes are different. So it seems that people were free to sing various different melodies. For those items that are attributed to Saint Nerses, the 12th century saint, one of which is this, and this is included in the Sahakiants suite, we shall play it, and this also, which is in the middle of the Sahakiants suite, the neumes are practically the same. So over the above period of a century and a half, scribes dealt with such respect to those transcriptions that they reproduce the musical signs with great accuracy. This is the first item, and if you look, you can see that the musical signs are the same, there and there and here. The same thing applies to the other hymn attributed to Saint Nerses, there and there and there. But this oldest manuscript, the Paris one of 1241, copied in Razarg in Cilicia, in 1241, as I said, there are a lot of stanzas, and some of them are found in this manuscript, and I've compared that with this, which is from another folio of this manuscript. And another stanza, which is this one, is here. And again, the neumes are the same. Now, having talked about this hymn and having shown you the neumes, I shall play you a little bit of the present-day version in the form in which Sahakiants arranged it, played as ever in these demonstrations by the strings of the Charles University Orchestra in Prague, performing in this recording in Vienna. Now, you will probably want to know if indeed we cannot read the medieval neumes. If we can indeed not read the medieval neumes, then how on earth did we get the melodies that we have? Well, the melodies were transcribed mostly during the 19th century using a new notational system that redefined 7 of the old signs, of which the original medieval meaning was no longer known, with various tilde signs and tails and things added to them. It's a little like the tonic solfa musical system of notation. It's not neumes anymore. One sign corresponds to a particular note of a particular pitch, and there are different dots and hooks and things that indicate rhythm. And it is these two gentlemen, Hampartsum Limonjian and Father Minas Pezeshkian, the latter of the Mechitarist congregation in San Lazzaro in Venice, who invented and established this system. And we owe this system the bulk of the music that we've got. So thanks to the fact that these things were written down, we are able to read them. And we are able to read this notational system. And of course, certain things were also transcribed using Western staff notation. And one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest who certainly transcribed the entire Divine Liturgy in Western notation was the great Venetian musician Pietro Bianchini, one of whose symphonias the Charles University Orchestra and I had the very great pleasure of performing some time ago in order to provide a musical illustration for a lecture I gave at the Library of Congress in the United States a couple of years ago. This Venetian musician wrote a lot of masses, requiems, symphonias, chamber music, salon pieces, organ pieces. Most of it, unfortunately, is not published, but you can find bits and pieces in places like the musical archives of the Basilica of San Lazzaro, which I was very grateful to be given access to through the kindness of various friends and the music archivists and the procurator, to whom I'm most grateful. And Bianchini also arranged the melodies of the Divine Liturgy, which he published, and he was so enamored of this music that he spent years on the island of San Lazzaro to saturate himself with the singing of the monks, to write down as much of it as he could. And it seems that some of those arrangements of the Divine Liturgy were even intended to be sung by Italian singers, because I found in the archives a manuscript in his own hand where the Armenian words have been written in Italian transliteration. And I found this little slip of paper where he gives instructions to his, I assume, Italian singers about the flexibility and good taste that needs to be exercised when singing this music, saying that if you heed the rules of this art, then these chants are rendered sublime, celestial, and at once most pleasing to our hearts and to our ears. And we don't have a transcription of the melodies of the Divine Liturgy by the great musicologist of Haig-Utidjian, a Constantinopolitan musician and musicologist, but he does describe the succession of the keys of various items that used to be sung in the Divine Liturgy in his own day, and it does seem very familiar. So it does seem that at least during the last couple of centuries, things didn't change all that much, but he does warn that he witnessed quite a lot of chaos when people would fail to dovetail one item to the other in a satisfactory way, and they would modulate quite a lot. He wrote, there is no harmonious order in what is being done. There was chaos, apparently. If you want to know more about Dendesian and his transcriptions and his work, I recently published a monograph on some of his achievements. He is still a very useful guide, and he has opened all sorts of doors for musicological research. Now, still in that Armenian notation invented in the 19th century, we have another version of the Divine Liturgy, more or less the same melodies that we find in the Komitas that found their way in the Sahakiants suite, made by Christopher Karamurza, who was born in the Crimea in present-day Ukraine. And his own version of the Divine Liturgy used to be considered to be lost until recently, when my good friend, the late Haig Utidjian, discovered it in some archives in Armenia where no one had recognized what they were in 2007, and shortly thereafter he published it and he sent me his edition, for which I'm extremely grateful. And Karamurza is very interesting because in his own day, there was a lot of opposition by the church to having the melodies of the Mass of the Divine Liturgy harmonized. Karamurza premiered his four-part version in Baku in 1886. He was associated with other musicians of his time. He knew Pietro Bianchini, he knew Mikhail Ippolitov Ivanov, whose music is quite familiar to members of the Charles University Orchestra, I believe. For 4 years, he was able to perform the harmonized version, but the bishop of the day was a conservative gentleman, apparently. And first, in order to give the impression of being fair, he said, okay, get your choir to sing me your harmonized version, and then sing me the version in a single voice. And the bishop said, oh, it sounds better with a single voice, so no more harmonization. Karamurza was so annoyed that in a symbolic gesture, he handed over to the bishop a candelabrum, a sort of chandelier which had 4 candles, and he switched off the light of 3 of the candles, leaving only one of the candles lit to symbolize the fact that whilst Karamurza was willing to offer the light from 4 candles, the bishop, being conservative and not particularly enlightened, preferred to be lit by the dimmer light of only a single light. Some rather pleasing and perhaps amusing symbolism is there. But Karamurza went on to better things. He was invited to the Mother See in Etchmiadzin, and he had the chance of performing his 4-part liturgy there. And here we have a connection with Komitas. Komitas was a young novice studying there, and he would sometimes be given solos to sing in the choir conducted by Karamurza, in Karamurza's arrangement, of course, at this stage. But apparently Komitas himself, in his youth, you can see a photograph of his dressed as a deacon. Komitas would sometimes have himself objections against harmonization, saying to Karamurza, God is one, music too should be in a single voice. But then Karamurza would answer back and say, why do you forget that God is the union of 3 persons? One way or the other, though, these performances at Etchmiadzin of the Mass with 4 parts provoked the enmity of conservatives, who kept commenting things like, the church is a holy place, not a theater. And Karamurza happened to be a Catholic by birth, and they would say, may the composer go to his Catholic comrades and propagate his harmonization there. God is one, singing should also be in one voice. Polyphony is appropriate to polytheism. Things were uncertain because the elderly head of the church, Catholicos Makar, whom you see here, passed away, and Mgrdich Hrimian succeeded him. And there were a lot of hopes that he was going to be more modern and forward-looking, but it appears that, at least initially, Hrimian was also conservative, and he actually dismissed Karamurza from his position with a bittersweet sort of farewell parting shot, saying, you are a great master, very useful to the nation. The work you have started is good work, but the seminary walls are too narrow for you. But not long after that, Komitas was allowed to conduct his own 4-part arrangement of various items from the Divine Liturgy, but the conservative monks again protested, this time saying that Komitas's liturgy reeks of Protestantism. However, eventually harmonization was allowed because the Catholicos Hrimian, whom you can see in this painting there, sanctioned and authorized the harmonization of Jekmalian, who was a teacher of Komitas, and this was published in Leipzig by Breitkopf und Hertel in 1896. Likewise, another harmonized version that was published in Calcutta similarly received the approval of a later Catholicos, of a later patriarch, in 1917. So it was permitted in the Armenian Church to perform the Divine Liturgy in harmonized choral versions. Of course, church musicians had to be careful, and in the preface to his 1896 harmonized volume, Yeghmalian, whose version we shall briefly look at in a moment, argued very carefully that harmonization is not against the spirit of our church, since harmonization constitutes the perfection and fulfillment of music, which our ancestors were not against. And harmonization renders the sacred chants of our church perfect and the most beautiful possible. We have to do this according to the state of development of the art of music in each century. However, he had to be very, very careful, and he made a point of stressing that he had kept the traditional melodies unchanged in his harmonized version. So he got away with it, and he opened the way to others, such as Komitas, for example. Now, it is interesting to contrast this attitude with a rather more conservative position adopted by the Greek Orthodox Church. Greek church musicians also wanted to have harmonized versions of their sacred chants, and indeed harmonized versions were heard in Vienna. But the Holy Synod immediately put a stop to it, saying this is a sinful innovation, a grave mistake and dangerous. It approaches the customs of the foreigners and the heterodox. And this is an interesting sentence. Four-part harmony seduces the ears, charms the senses, and enfeebles the soul. It's the music of those who are relaxing and amusing themselves, not suitable for the church. This is Yeghmalian, whom I mentioned, and his own version is perhaps the most popular one. It's the one that you hear in most Armenian churches all over the world. And Komitas was his student, but Komitas was not satisfied by his master's version. He wanted to create his own, as he did. And I mentioned a version published in Calcutta. This is it. It was by Amy Apkar, who was a remarkable woman. As a young woman, she actually transcribed the melodies herself. She was a musician. But for the harmonization, she sought the help of a certain Dr. Slater, who was apparently the Anglican organist of St. Paul's Cathedral in Calcutta. And almost certainly her version, done in collaboration with this Dr. Slater, was performed for many years in the Armenian Church of St. Nazareth in Calcutta. And this church is the Church of St. Paul's, where the organist who helped her harmonize the melodies was active. There's yet another interesting harmonized version, still written in the Armenian notation of the early 19th century, by Levon Chilingirian, who is the grandfather of the distinguished London violinist and the leader of the Chilingirian Quartet, and a professor at the Royal College of Music and the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, Levon Chilingirian. This photograph is from a manuscript of his first version, published in Smyrna, nowadays Izmir, in 1898. A version in Western notation was published much later in Jerusalem in 1931. And so this is the background that takes us all the way to the Komitas version that formed the basis of Sahakiants' concert suite. Here you see the opening of the Sanctus, but sometimes he was able to find melodies that were not published. So he used some melodies that were already available in print, but he arranged them, he harmonized them, he made polyphonic arrangements of them, but he also transcribed versions that would not have survived had it not been for his own work. One such melody is this, which I sometimes perform with members of the Charles University Chorus. This is a hymn that is sung when the celebrant at the Divine Liturgy is of bishop's rank or higher. O select of God, under Yalt hast du. Let's listen to a bit of it.
Under
This was recorded with myself singing the melody and a number of friends to whom I'm most grateful singing the other parts in Prague, to whom I'm extremely grateful for joining me. Now, I should like to contrast now Jekmarian's version. Komitas' version of the same melody. So this is something that we find as the next item in the Sahakiants suite in the Komitas version. But you see how Jekmarian treated the same melody so differently from Komitas, who adopted a much more original approach. Now, as an experiment, I should like to play you another very beautiful part of the Sahakiants suite for strings in the various versions to which the same traditional melody was subjected by the different arrangers, choral arrangers, starting with the Karamurza version. So simple chords, as you see, it's almost primitive, but it has a certain charm of its own. We will now hear the Ekmalian version, where he uses chords in a greater variety of different positions, and this is the version that is best known, and it's the version you're most likely to come across if you happen to walk into an Armenian church on a Sunday morning. We are gradually approaching the Sahakiants suite, but it's the same melody. I wonder if at least first violins in the Charles University Orchestra have recognized this melody yet. Anyone? Well, let us pass on. This is one of Komitas's versions, but not the version. This is a version by Komitas, but not the version that Sahakiants chose. The version that Sahakiants chose is much more adventurous and a much more imaginative and forward-looking harmonization with some chords that had not been heard before. You find similar chords in the opening and ending of Schoenberg's Chamber Suite No. 2, or Benjamin Britten's Rejoice in the Lamb, or Franck Martin's Petite Symphonie Concertante, with changes in tonal axis. Just have a listen to this and listen to the chords. This is the version that members of our orchestra will recognize because that's the one they've played in the Sahakiants suite. And there's a modulation. Listen to where we were, where we started, and where we ended up. And now a little bit of the version as played by the Charles University Orchestra and myself, with a solo beautifully played by our concertmistress Lydia Penchev. This was recorded in Vienna. For a brief excursus now from what we're doing. No, I did not get my presentation slides mixed. This is Dvorak, I know, different from Komitas. Why am I showing you this slide? Well, this is the excursus. Not long ago, I was commissioned by the Antonin Dvorak Museum of Prague to do some work on the composer's sketches for the Mass in D, of which my new critical edition my new critical edition of the work, not of the sketches, of the work was published a few months ago by Berenreiter. And I had occasion to look at the sketches left by the composer, which is a very exciting way of penetrating the composer's mind, because there are a lot of corrections, changes. You can see how his thinking is evolving, what he retains in the autograph fair copy, what he changes, why he might have chosen to do one thing or the other. In fact, looking at the sketches was useful for the critical edition of the definitive version of, or one of the definitive versions as well, because you could see that a mistake that was carried over unconsciously from one manuscript to the other had its origins in something that he had changed in the sketch. Why do I mention this? Because just as this is being done and has been done in the case of Dvorak's very fine Mass in D, in my view, Komitas's liturgy also deserves similar treatment. It is, after all, perhaps the greatest masterpiece in the whole of Armenian music that there is. And we do have a draft and some sketches, a fair copy only for some pages of the liturgy. So here on the right-hand side, you can see the Chorut Chorin that we heard. On the right-hand side is the fair copy, on the left-hand side is the draft. Here there's no problem, the draft is very, very legible, and it seems that nothing much has changed. But you can see a more extreme instance here. This is a processional hymn, where on the left-hand side you've got this bird's nest that is very difficult to make head and tails of. He even made some additions and corrections in the older notational system that does not use staff paper. So this work still remains to be done. And finally, as you may have surmised, the Komitas version is not the only one, but in addition to harmonizations by different people, such as Karamurza, Yekmalyan, Amy Apkar, and Dr. Slater, of traditional melodies from one part of the world or other, there were some composers who composed their own melodies, either for certain parts of the Divine Liturgy, certain variables, or even complete liturgies. Ara Bartevian, a pupil of Vincent d'Indy at the Schola Cantorum, is one. A Vienna Archbishop, Arsène Aydenian, is another. His version was orchestrated in association with a Viennese musician called Böhm. I'm told he had nothing to do with the late Karl Böhm, the conductor. Edgar Manas and Grigor Chulhayan in Constantinople, and more recently by my friends Horen Mehanegian and George Kirazian, both of whose versions have been recorded. I found out that there's a Ukrainian musician called Kropivnitsky, who also made a 3-part version in 1873, apparently, but I've never been able to find it. And so we end with the culmination of almost a millennium of transmission and development and composition and arrangement to the concert suite by Sahakiants. And unlike the very first prelude, the patriarchal prayer, for some of the bits, he actually did a bit of cutting and pasting, transposition, but always in a judicious and tasteful way. So, for example, for the final Sanctus, you don't just hear the Sanctus first at 1 octave in the beginning, and then an octave higher in a much more ethereal and luminous reprise, as it were. He follows it by this hymn that starts here, where it says Tranquillo e pensieroso. That's Hayriet Nahor, which we saw in various manuscripts attributed to St. Narcissus the Gracious, and Hamenaini Ornemkeskes, as you see in this numated manuscript from 1241, and that appears here. So he was very creative, but I think that it was really a stroke of genius, because I do not object to anything that he did. On the contrary, it conduces to a very, very successful and effective concert piece. I'm honored that I had occasion to perform it in its entirety in many different places, in a lot of very beautiful venues in the Czech Republic and abroad with the Charles University Orchestra. I've performed it with others also, including with the Cyprus Symphony Orchestra in 2015 on the day of Komitas' passing. And this is the program of our more recent performance at the Mkhitarist Monastery. And these are some photographs from the Czech Museum of Music, where we performed the European premiere, I believe, in 2014, the Goethe Institute in Prague, the chapel of the Italian Center in the center of Prague, the famous Chapel of Mirrors at the Clementinum at the very heart of Prague here, and at the Aula of the Carolinum on the 24th of April last year, and then more recently at the Church of Holy Mary, St. Mary the Protector at the Mkhitarist Monastery in Vienna. And this was also from my concert with the strings of the Cyprus Symphony Orchestra. We found that the program worked very well, because in the first half we put the Metamorphosen for 26 solo strings by Richard Strauss, and in the second half the Komitas Sahakiants Suite. I propose that we end by playing the Sanctus, if I can find it, as it was recorded not in Vienna as per this photograph, but in the Czech Museum of Music in 2006. Now I shall endeavor to find the right place. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the Charles University Orchestra with all its strings, whereas in Vienna, because of the limited space in the chancel where we could perform, we had a reduced group. So I displayed this beautiful Vienna photograph, which was kindly made available to me by Mr. Tomas Bazika of Czech Radio. I don't have a video from the performance from which we heard this last excerpt. It was at the Czech Museum of Music, and it was recorded live by Dr. Vladimir Faltus on the 4th of April 2016. This is, I would say, of our joint attempts, probably the one that I'm happiest with, but it's not yet on YouTube, and I hope sometime over the next few months, with the help of Mr. Wojciech Salajka of our orchestra, we will put together, because we don't have a video of the event, we will put together a nice audiovisual version on YouTube with photographs from various medieval manuscripts and other archival visual material to go with the music, and then make that available on YouTube. So I should very much like to express my profound gratitude to all those organizations and individuals who have helped me with the work of which the distillation you have been able to hear at this evening's presentation. But above all, my profound thanks go to our wonderful string players, orchestral musicians who made all this possible. And of course, to you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. And I should now like to ask if by any chance anyone has any questions. I shall stop sharing my screen. Yes, any questions? I cannot hear anything. Perhaps you need to unmute yourself. Tom, you look as if you might have a question.
Yes, Maestro. There was a piece that you sang, which was notated, and it appeared to be in the key of D major, but then there was a modulation, and I noticed, you know, I was singing along, and I said, wait a minute, these are not F sharps, these are F naturals, and then there was a single sharp, a G sharp. Is this a modal?
Yes.
Change?
Yes, it alternates between E minor and a kind of harmonic A minor. So let me see if I can. So this is an E under and that it modulates up a perfect fourth. So there's a pedal E, but it's now modulated, one could say, in Western musical terms, up a perfect fourth to the key of A, with that very characteristic augmented second. you know, from F natural to G sharp to A, that is peculiar to a harmonic musical scale.
Thank you. And
but this particular movement actually does not appear in the suite, but I included it because it's one of the remarkable things that Komitas did. This, you cannot find quite this melody in any other source. So I assume it's one of the things that he may have gathered by visiting village churches and cornering clergymen in remote places and asking them to sing things for him.
I see. And where did he? Where was his field work done? Was he in the West as well at that time?
I'm not quite sure where he managed to go. Much of it was done not very far from Etchmiadzin. So it was within what is known as the Araratian plain, the Araratian Dasht. Because generally speaking, he had to return to the monastery that same evening. I'm not aware that when he was in Constantinople, he was able to travel to the depths of historical Armenia. I don't know. I know that Dondesian did a little bit of that. I know that he traveled, but he traveled in the later part of his career to various European centers where he could organize. There were large Armenian communities, and he could organize choirs and choruses and teach them his arrangements and give concerts with them. But it is known that he managed to gather well over 1,000, perhaps more, folk melodies. But unfortunately, during the First World War, when he became ill and he was taken to a mental hospital, first in Constantinople, then in Paris, and then another one in Paris. A lot of his stuff seems to have been irrevocably lost. So what we have is probably just a fraction of what he managed to gather. And of course, these places themselves perished, those communities no longer existed. And so it's a very grave loss. But we have to be grateful for the jewels that we do have, thanks to his own transcriptions, be they sacred music or folk pieces. But that's not where his genius lies, although we owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude. His genius lies in what he did with the material that he gathered, with the way in which he cultivated it. He brought up the modal qualities, and he could sense what he could do in terms of experimenting with harmony, treating a melody as if the tonic was not the tonic, but building chords using fourths instead of thirds, and pretending that the tonic axis is somewhere other than where most people would say that it is, something that he can do because of the modality of the music. So he was a visionary in that respect. Any other questions?
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, don't be shy, but do make sure you unmute yourself before you pose a question.
Now, I had another question.
Well, let's hear it.
Now, I recall the date when you were discussing Komitas of April 24th, 1915.
That was the night when he, together with a group of other artists and intellectuals, were arrested by the government. Yes.
Precisely. That is considered the start of the genocide.
Yes.
That day.
And this divine liturgy, of which we have heard bits in the arrangement for strings by Sahakiants, was premiered only a week or two before them. It was sung once, and it was going to be sung again, but it could not. The First World War had already started quite a few months earlier, but church musicians, many of them were clerks and deacons and subdeacons, they, according to Ottoman law, anyone who had a theological rank, whether Christian or Muslim, was at that stage still exempt from war. So Komitas lost his choral singers in terms of secular music, but he still had a small group of singers with whom he was able to sing his latest version of the Divine Liturgy, which we believe to correspond to this. But there's quite a lot of manuscript material, but much of it is difficult to read through it. I've been to one of the two museums where some of this material is kept, and I'm trying to get high quality photographs of it, so that once all of it is at my disposal, I can try and see how to make head and tails of it, because it would be interesting to follow his thinking. In his letters, he mentions several versions, but of course, what often happened is that he had what he wanted to do in his head. He just jotted down particular parts. People, of course, could not photocopy, Xerox, or scan material as easily as we can now. In fact, they couldn't do it at all. And so things would be copied by hand, and it would be given out to musicians who had them available when they sang. And this sort of material gets very easily lost, particularly during the upheavals of war and dispersal and catastrophe. But also the oral traditions of folk music and sacred music also tend to be obliterated by improved communications. Things become standardized, things become more westernized. At about the same time, there were experiments in trying to incorporate the use of the organ in Armenian churches. In San Lazzaro, in Venice, where the Mkhitarist fathers have their main monastery, they started using the organ quite early on. But in other places, there was a lot of opposition because instruments were associated with, I don't know, secular entertainment and so on and so forth. There was an attempt in Constantinople to use a flute during services, a traditional Eastern flute. These things sound very, very lovely. And for a while, a musician was allowed to play, but the patriarch of the time put a stop to it. Then Levon Chingrian's grandfather, whom I mentioned in the talk because he himself harmonized a version of the Divine Liturgy chants, he was the first in Constantinople who tried to use the organ. And conservative monks, apparently, overnight, went into the church and with a sharp knife severed the pipes of the bellows, you know, of the motor that pumps air so that the organ sounds. So his attempts were sabotaged. So these things happened gradually.
Amazing. This goes on, you know, this is the same story over centuries.
Yes, and of course, in the case of the Greek tradition, they still do not accept the use of an organ. I have heard harmonized singing. The Synod's encyclical, from which I quoted, was never formally retracted, but singing in more than a single voice is tolerated, and in certain places, it's even encouraged. I myself am in two minds about this, because as far as organs are concerned, beautifully played organ and harmonizations by musicians who have the necessary sensitivity and understanding of the modality of the music can enrich the musical and spiritual experience. But in most churches, you find that the organ is played badly, and the harmonizations are sometimes not very good. You even encounter versions that are not even grammatically acceptable. And in such instances, you say, if only there were no electricity and that lousy organ would stop. In terms of harmonization, now, every skillful harmonization, it's a little like looking at a multifaceted diamond. These chants are like diamonds, and every harmonization, as it were, throws light on this diamond from a slightly different angle. But the diamond has many different facets to it. One of the good things, if you go to a church where the chanting is being done very beautifully, but in unison and not in a harmonization with several voices, you are still at liberty using your own musical imagination and using your own inner ear, as it were, mentally to harmonize it. And you have the liberty, you have the freedom to do it differently every time, because it's in the music. The music has the potential to be interpreted in terms of its harmonical implications in several different ways. And why have the tyranny of one particular version every time, when in fact the music has this multivalent property to it? And you can interpret it differently. You can imagine it as being G major, or some other occasion you can imagine it as being a very, very strange but beautiful sort of B minor, depending on whether, because these melodies move and they meander, particularly older, more archaic melodies, and we have a few examples of those. They're not even particularly amenable to harmonization. They zigzag. They work in a different way in creating tensions and in proceeding to resolve those tensions. You know, one extreme would be Bach's sonatas and partitas for solo violin. There's a lot of linear harmony there. Even then, when you're not engaged in double stopping, triple stopping, playing more than a single string at a time, the way the music moves, it actually creates its chords. They're very clearly implied, and when you're listening to it, you can easily imagine the harmony that goes with the music. But then there are other things that lend themselves to being construed in more than a single way, harmonically. And then there are other things, and these tend to be the more archaic examples of Armenian sacred music, where it would be actually inappropriate to harmonize. At most, you might have a pedal, a sort of drone bass, holding the note. But even that, if you can do without that, you have a different experience that is at least as valid as the version with the drone. And my contention is that even conservative church musicians in Constantinople in the 19th century who were against harmonization themselves were willy-nilly, whether they wanted it or not, influenced by Western music, because it was all around them in Constantinople. Constantinople was a very cosmopolitan place. So their way of perceiving music and the way music worked for them became more and more related with harmony. So they participated in a process of unwitting filtration. If you were a church musician, a music master, and you were going to teach your pupils a particular hymn for a special church feast, you had the choice between, let us say, 3 or 4 versions, and you would automatically choose the version that you thought worked best. And so by choosing version A rather than versions B, C, or D, you engaged in a process of filtration. The versions that were most popular were the ones that were copied out, the ones that were taught and transmitted, and those that were less in accord with the taste of the day fell by the wayside. And we've got a few manuscripts, but not very much. But there are hints that the older music works in a different sort of way. And that may be one of the reasons why it is virtually impossible to surmise what the medieval neumes signified through a process of putting together the melodies that we have and the manuscripts with the medieval neumes. You find that the correspondence is very, very limited. At most, it may have something to do with rhythm and meter, in that church musicians, even in the 19th century, were convinced that some of these musical signs that they couldn't read, nonetheless told you that you've got to spend 2 beats on this syllable of text, whereas on that syllable of text where there's a different neume, you should spend 1 beat. But that 1 beat could be 2 quarter notes or 1 half note or whatever. This doesn't tell us anything about the internal rhythm, about the content of those beats. But they would use the neumes for rough orientation of this sort. And so most of the melodies that we've got do tend to conform to this, for the melodies of the hymnal, for example. But other than that, there seems to be very little correlation, because the melodies change conceivably beyond recognition. And that is natural. Any sort of vital living tradition, an organic tradition, evolves and changes. And musicians for a very long time were not particularly concerned about preserving the old melodies. The idea of preserving the traditional melodies is something new. And the idea of giving fixity to melodies is actually something that came from the Western tradition at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th. But before then, the church probably conservatively made the scribes copy the old neumes with minimal change, more or less faithfully, across the centuries. But you cannot suppress the creativity of musicians. Each generation wishes to create its own versions in accordance with its own tastes and inclinations, and of increasing sophistication, more and more melismatic melodies, where you find that over a single syllable of text, people sing for quite a long time. And so things develop, and people aren't interested in what the melody that was sung during the time of their grandfather or great-grandfather or centuries earlier was. They're interested in their own thing. And it was only at the end of the 18th century when Armenian church musicians started asking, but wait a minute, what were the old melodies like? And then they found that they had lost the key. But that's not the only reason. There were many catastrophes, enforced discontinuities in the transmission of the tradition. Monasteries were burnt to the ground, destroyed, communities were destroyed and displaced, and this happened not just in 1915, this has happened in the more distant past as well. The fall of Ani, the destruction of the Cilician kingdom in 1375, and so on and so forth. So in those circumstances, you may have isolated communities of monks who have their own melodies, they develop independently, or someone who knows the old melodies does not have the chance of teaching anyone else. And also musicians had a penchant for secrecy. You know, even in the 19th century, we've got documented instances of teachers being worried that their livelihood would be stolen by their own pupils, and pupils secretly going to the master's house when they know that he's not at home and telling the master's wife, the master has sent me, he forgot his notebook of melodies, and the innocent woman giving the melodies and then the pupil disappearing somewhere in the country for 2 months and copying everything, so that he will be able to sing those things as well. And even in the Byzantine tradition, where they do have manuals that are meant to teach you the Byzantine neumes, known as papadike, each papadiki, you know, the language in which the way in which the Greek Middle Byzantine neumes, which we are able to read more or less, the language in which these are described sounds very esoteric and mysterious. Why? It's meant to be able to remind you, if you've been to a teacher and you understand the principles of the system, then the way it's written is intended to remind you of what you learned. But it's written in such a way that someone else, if he gets hold of the text, cannot teach himself or herself It's not meant for self-study. It's meant to be protected against self-study. So perhaps a tendency for secrecy may have played a role as well. We don't know. People, can speculate, but there are various hints here and there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, are there any other questions? If there are none, allow me to say that next week, the session will be rather different. I shall be having the first of my distinguished guests. It's going to be Neil Metcalfe, the chorus master of the University of Edinburgh Musical Society Chorus, a 180-piece chorus, one of the largest university choruses anywhere, I think, in Europe, or for all I know, the United States. A chorus that I've been privileged to attend some of the rehearsals of and concerts of. And Neil is a very charismatic chap, and you will find the session to be very, very stimulating and in the very best possible sense, inspiring and entertaining. So please do join me a week from now for that session. Thank you very much indeed for your attention, ladies and gentlemen, and a special thanks to all those musicians and singers who have performed with me excerpts from the Komitas Divine Liturgy, whether in the original choral version or in Sahakiants' marvelous arrangement for strings. Thank you very much indeed. Have a very good week, and see you in a week's time. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, Maestro.